to understand that there were ties between Easthampton and other communities. And that's when we reached out, I think in the second summer, more interns, including one of my daughters. We reached out to Donnamarie, and we went and visited her at Sylvester Manor, and it was just this remarkable meeting of the minds. I remember we sat sort of in the back. Sylvester Manor, it feels like it is a house, and even the office feels sort of like a house. And you sit in the back of the sofa, and I remember we sat down, and Donnamarie, do you remember that meeting? I
do. We had not met before.
Right. I know we've been spoken or anything.
Right. And so we kind of introduced ourselves to each other. And, I'm the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm. And you came over with your daughter and your niece and sort of told me about this project you had started and this list of names that you had accumulated, and that you were up to 300. And the magnitude of this discovery and the meaningfulness of what was happening was so overwhelming for me that I burst into tears. Yeah. That this was just unbelievable and something that we did not know. When I started at Sylvester Manor as a volunteer in 2014, after reading Matt Griswold's book. Before that, as a lifelong Sag Harbor summer resident and full-time resident, I didn't know. I didn't know that there was slavery on the east end of Long Island, or that there was this place called Sylvester Manor that was what we call a provisioning plantation that was started in the mid-17th century, and that this was a place of enslavement. I didn't know that. And so to further along the work and the discoveries that I was making at the manor and connecting it to the discoveries that David was making in Easthampton, to sort of see that this work had this significance in letting us all know that this was something that happened here where we live in a history that we had no idea about. And so it became very exciting, and we immediately started collaborating and discovered we're terrific partners because we are both storytellers. And so in these ensuing years and throughout this summer, we have been telling these stories of our discoveries. And what the stories come out to be are the stories of people's lives. These are people who were enslaved, indentured. There were also free people of color who had been manumitted, who had bought their freedom, and who are equal citizens in the establishment of our towns and villages on the east end of Long Island. That from the very beginning, from the very inception of this place, this was a place that was inhabited by three distinct cultures who come together here. The European settlers, the indigenous native people, and the enslaved Africans who were brought here against their will. And so that's how the project began, and that's the work that we're continuing. And 4 years in, I think, if it's 3-4 years in, it is still as exciting. And on any given day, David and or I can make a new discovery and establish a new story.
Yeah. That's really true. I think listening to you talk about that, I realized that not only didn't we know, but I didn't even know it was possible to identify these people. And not only is it possible, it's possible to say something about them on a very specific day. And I tell a lot of people when we talk about the project that just to be able to say one thing about an enslaved person or a free person of color who lived in Easthampton on such and such a date in such and such a year and did this is frankly kind of a radical rethinking of history. And I don't mean that in a presumptuous way, but it's just the idea that, well, for example, in 1676, there's a guy, and he's identified as John in the town records, and he's a free black man. And the town fathers, you know, the Daytons and Osbornes and Hobart and whomever, say that we see you're building a house here in the road, and that means over by Town Pond, you know, in view of my window. And we're going to let you keep building this house. In fact, we'll give you a little more land for a garden or an orchard, but you can't own this land. You can't give it to your children. You can't sell it. And if you remove from this place, it shall revert to the way it was before. And so you think 1676, you have a free black man in East Hampton. I mean, this is 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. It's just one generation into the European occupation of what became East Hampton. And this is essentially on the, you know, across from Town Pond here. And it, you know, it raises a lot of questions, sure, but just the fact that we know that a man named John, who was of African heritage, built himself a house here, I think is just kind of, that's where I think our project gets a lot of its strength, a lot of its excitement is just these small facts about people, day-to-day facts. You know, it's easy to say 300, 500 or whatever, but when you know their names, and you know, I think to a large extent, this whole idea about names kind of came from you, Donnamarie. I mean, we're certainly listing people by name, but I feel like a lot of the power in the storytelling at Sylvester Manor revolves around names. And, you know, I mean, I think, for example, could you talk a little bit about the way you created that exhibit with the staircase with the names? It's just,
Sure.
there's power in names, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So sorry, you know, these days getting dates together is kind of difficult. In 2018, I curated an exhibition at Sylvester Manor that was entitled Women of the Manor. And one of the marvelous parts of my job as a curator there is overseeing and archiving the collection, the various collections of books, paintings, and most extraordinarily photographs. And because my background is in photography and photojournalism, this was, you know, this is a joy of my job. So I curated an exhibition of photographs of the women of the manor, along with painted portraits of some of the earlier descendants. But I had no image to represent the enslaved women. And I only had their names that were listed on last wills and testaments and account books, some mentions in letters, and other documents. And so it was a big problem, you know, that I couldn't figure out. I just kept saying, I only have their names. And what I decided to do was we had a calligrapher write the names of the women, and we posted them on the risers of the staircase in the back of the manor off the dining room. That's called the slave staircase. The slave staircase in the manor house that was built in 1735 spirals to the first floor bedrooms and then to the attic space where the enslaved and indentured people lived. And so it's become a permanent tribute to the enslaved women of Sylvester Manor that their names are placed on these stairs, that many of them would have gone up and down in service to this family. And it's a very powerful statement. And when I give a tour and we get to that point and I talk about the history of enslavement at the manor and the role of these women, people are very moved just by seeing the names. And so that's what David means, that having their names and seeing them on documents can bring somebody alive. And I think we should talk a little bit about the documents that we find in places like the East Hampton Library or historical societies, or at the manor in our vault and in the documents that are there, or at the NYU Fields Library where 10,000 of the documents were donated. But specifically at the East Hampton Library, doing some research, just looking up Sylvester Manor, I found a document that's a manumission paper for a woman named Matilda. And Matilda first appears in a in an inventory taken by Thomas Deering, who was the proprietor of Sylvester Manor in the 18th century, pre-revolution. He had married one of the descendants, Mary Sylvester, and he lists in this inventory 5 enslaved people, one of which is a woman, or a young woman, named Matilda. Now, that inventory is dated 1765. Then we move ahead to the Revolutionary War years, and the leading families of Long Island go into exile in Connecticut. Except there is a family story at Sylvester Manor that some of the more faithful slaves were left behind to guard the house. And perhaps Matilda was one of them, because in 1795, she is manumitted. She's given her freedom by Thomas Deering's son, Sylvester Deering, and his other son, Henry Packer Deering, and his son-in-law, Nathaniel Gardner. And that paper is, that original manumission paper is in the collection at Easthampton. And finding it was it's a very powerful experience when you find one of these kind of documents and you see what's listed. And her manumission paper, excuse me, says that she's under the age of 50, which means that I can kind of extrapolate how old she may have been. She may have been a young girl in 1765, and 30 years later, she's maybe 45. Matilda then goes on in her freedom to rent a piece of property from the family that enslaved her, and she builds a house. But to build this house, she must borrow money from Henry Packer Deering, who was, in fact, one of the men who inherited her. And so she has to then pay back the loan, pay rent on the land to the Sylvester family for the house she's living in. But she is a free woman of color, and the last notation of her is the 1810 census for Shelter Island, where she is listed as the head of household and a free woman of color. So in this way of finding the names on a document, we go from her being listed on an inventory to being given her freedom, to a rental agreement for her home, to being listed on the United States federal census as a freeborn woman and a head of her household. And so from a single name, we have now constructed a story of a life. And those are the things that David and I continuously find and excitingly share with each other. And we build on these stories. And yes, we can say that we have over 300, close to almost 500 names now. But the individual stories are the ones that become the most meaningful.
One of the really interesting things about this, and going in, I thought, well, maybe the Gardner family had some enslaved people. I knew there were supposedly slave quarters on Gardner's Island. But what we have documented is that slavery was essentially the norm that among people of means in Easthampton and Southold, Shelter Island, Southampton, that it was basically ubiquitous, and that enslaved Black people, enslaved Indians, Native people, so Pequots who were captured in the Pequot War, were sort of a fact of life here, that these were people who would, were known by their name or their first name walking down the street, that were part of the economic fabric. And so, one thing I say frequently is that basically if you have a name, a street named after you in Easthampton or any of these places, that is a person of means, and that person 9 times out of 10, that family is going to be enslavers. And so you've got names like, certainly many members of my family, which is a whole separate, on my father's side were Edwardses and Huntings and so on. And so, your Osbornes and your Daytons, Buell, Reverend Buell was an enslaver. And what's fascinating to me is that the enslaved here in Easthampton seem to do anything. So if you have an Osborne who had a tannery where the Maidstone Inn is today, and he had enslaved people, it's likely they were involved in tanning. And there's sort of some enigmas. There's a guy named Cato who we're fascinated by, because he seems to go through tons and tons of shoes. So he gets 6 pairs of shoes in a year. And so we ask ourselves, well, what is Cato's deal? What is he doing? And, is he hauling flax to the port in Sag Harbor? Or, so what's fascinating, I mean, to me, is the ubiquity and the commonness of the enslaved people here, which circles to one of the key frustrations for me. And what we're trying to do in this project is a sense of, why wasn't I told? There's a wonderful narrative that I recommend to anybody who's interested in this subject. It's a guy named Venture Smith, and he was captured in, I think, what's present day Ghana, and brought initially to the Caribbean as a boy, and then he ends up enslaved on Fisher's Island. And he eventually, to make a very long story short, he dictates his life story to an abolitionist later on, but he's able to buy his freedom through a variety of different ways. He made money primarily cutting wood. And one of the places he says in his memoir that he cut wood was Long Island. So Fisher's Island's part of Southold Town. He probably has, cut wood and walked where I've walked. His memoir, or his life story, has gone through all sorts of editions. And I got to be about 55, 56 years old before I found out about Venture Smith. And I just think, well, how is it that, what is this education system? How is it that my grandmother, who was this teller of what sort of passed for history, omitted that? I mean, this is this monumental part of the development of the colonies, the southern New England colonies, and truthfully, the United States. It's sort of inseparable from the economic output that was dependent on slavery. Why wasn't I told? Why didn't I know about Venture Smith? And there's a whole host of reasons, but one of the things we're trying to do is bring stories like Venture Smith to light, bring it into the schools, for example. We as a country have an idea of where we came from that, when you look at the data, is not defensible. That's the thing, and that's the value. Not to talk too much about how great the Long Island collection is, but these documents are data. You can't argue with the fact that there were enslaved people here, because these, I'll open one up in a second, you can see, there they are. And one thing with the Plain Sight Project is that we don't think of ourselves as, we're not going to advocate for a monument or demand a lecture series or whatever. We see ourselves as providing the stories, providing this data. In fact, I had this idea, I think Larry Cantwell was still supervisor at the time, and I thought how neat it would be to print, a single piece of paper for all 400 or 500 names that we have, and then just walk in and just flap it on his desk and say, hey, here they are. What are we going to do about it? And I think it's really what we're talking about is building sort of a wall of names that, metaphorically, that's just too big to ignore. And so we're reaching out to other towns. So we've got people looking in Southampton now, and some interest in Southold as well. Okay, so we weren't told, but we're not going to stand for that now. We're just going to tell anybody who listen, really, that there were enslaved people here, and they were inseparable from the founding of the country.
And that this is American history.
Yeah.
That this is not, we can't characterize this just as Black history. This is American history.
Oh, there's no question.
This is the founding of America and its history and its people.
Yeah.
And it's right here.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I always say is that, if these white colonists built the towns that, became the colonies that threw off the English yoke and became the United States, and enslaved people of African heritage worked side by side with those colonists, then they too built the towns that built the colonies, became the state, and so on. And that's not how the American story is understood. The Northeast, I didn't know. you know, maybe Donnamarie, this is a good juncture to get a feel for whether I was just the exception in not knowing about slavery in the North. Andrew, can you help us do that?
I think what we're going to try to do is that, as David said, he didn't know, and I have said I didn't know. And many times when I give a tour, at the end of it or throughout it, whenever I talk about the history of enslavement at Sylvester Manor, inevitably someone in the group will say, I didn't know that. I was never taught that. Why didn't I learn that in school? I didn't know there was slavery in the North. I didn't know that there was slavery on Long Island. I didn't know that emancipation of slavery in New York was in 1827. Why didn't I know? And these questions are asked by young people, old people, Black people, white people, all people ask this and have this reaction. So what we thought today would be that we would ask you who have joined us as participants, and we're going to try and figure out how to do this by a show of hands as we look at you in gallery view, to say, did you know? If you knew that there was slavery in the North, or that if you learned it in school, raise your hand. Okay.
Yeah. It's maybe half of the people.
Half. Yeah. Well, for those who did know and for those who did not know, we are telling these stories and we are trying to make this a part of the fabric of our communities and to share with you the stories of these lives, of these people, because they're very important and they're very wonderful, and they are stories of survival more than anything else. And they're different kind of stories. We're not talking about, you know, large plantations with 600, you know, to 1,000 enslaved people. We are talking about a blacksmith with 3 enslaved boys. I remember David told me about this blacksmith in Easthampton and an account book where he lists that he has 3 enslaved boys. Yeah. And we figured out, you know, just by imagining, which is a thing that we do a lot, and what you have to do when you're just having these documents and just listing. So if a blacksmith has 3 enslaved boys and he's teaching them the trade of being a blacksmith, one of the first things he would teach them is to make nails, right? Now, if this is the blacksmith who is in the town at the founding of East Hampton, and everyone coming to get their supplies to build their homes, and they're purchasing nails from the blacksmith that are made by the 3 enslaved boys, that means that the majority of the original homes of East Hampton were built with nails made by 3 enslaved African boys. And that's a different way to tell that story.
Yeah.
And it's like that over and over again in some of the information that we're finding. And that's the way that we want to share this story. Yeah. That, yes, this was slavery for all of its horrors and inhumane treatments. This was what it was. This was a part of this history. But these people, these enslaved people that we are now just uncovering and finding out about, were a part of the very fabric of this society and the very building of these towns and villages that we live in now and that we love and that we call our home. And as we move forward in our lives now, in whatever circumstance we will find ourselves going forward, embracing this history and knowing it and learning it will really inform how we act in our own lives and how we care about this place that we call a home. Yeah. So, David, do you want to share some of your documents?
Well, yeah, I was thinking maybe I would go through the process a little bit and see if I can figure out how to do this very quickly. We should be able to see.
Oh, good.
Is it up?
Yep.
Okay. So what you're looking at here is a 1657 or 1658. Essentially, it's a deposition in the Goody Garlic witchcraft trial. This was a case in which Elizabeth Gardner, who was a young mother, fell gravely ill after she gave birth, and said that there was a dark figure at the foot of her bed and all sorts of things. And so suspicion fell on Goody Garlick, whose first name I think might have been Elizabeth as well. I can't really remember actually. And so as Elizabeth Gardner, by this time she's married to a Loper, becomes more and more ill, her mother, who's Mary Gardner, the first Mary Gardner here, sends one of her enslaved people across the street right here, crossing the marshy area at the north end of Town Pond, and her name was Boose, B-O-O-S-E, and it's difficult to say this is Boose, but if you look at enough of the 17th century, mid-17th century handwriting, you can begin to figure out the words. And so what we have here, it to me is an extraordinary document, because this is Boose's name written by someone who not only knew her, but probably talked to her about this case. And so, you know, you have this physical connection to a story from 1657. Now, so Boose now is the earliest named enslaved person we know of in East Hampton. She turns up several instances later in Mary Gardner's will and so on. But it's kind of astonishing that you can just point to something and say, wow, this is 1657 in East Hampton, and Boose is a player in, you know, one of East Hampton's most celebrated, really colonial America's earliest witchcraft cases. Goody Garlick was acquitted, it is thought, perhaps through the intervention of Lyon Gardner, for whom she and her husband had worked. So that's an interesting document, but this here is sort of a key thing. What we're looking at, can you, someone let me know if we can see the top where it says October 17?
No. Okay,
so let me slide up. October 1762 should be at the top of the document.
Yeah.
Okay, so what this is what we call one of the Hedges family shoe books. And it is basically a commercial ledger. There wasn't really a lot of cash in those days. And so the way transactions were done was by keeping books, basically. And debts could be paid off in any variety of ways, but this is the Hedges shoemakers. And what they're doing here is just writing down who got what. And, you know, for years, I gotta be honest, I didn't really understand the specific value of old account books. I knew they were important. I knew you had to hold on to them, but I really couldn't put my finger on, well, what exactly do you do with these things? I mean, some sort of esoteric, you know, I don't know, a colonial economy, you know, academia stuff. I don't know, doctorates, you know, did they really matter? Well, it turns out that these shoe books matter a whole heck of a lot, and they are incredible windows into people's lives. I don't know, I think maybe I'll zoom in a little bit, because here we have, whoops, what am I doing? How can I do this without making a mess? Okay, so here we have John Mulford Negro Pomp to a pair of shoes. And then there's this word it appeals to be heel tapped, T-A-P-T. I don't know what that means. And down below here, we have John Mulford's Negro boy to a pair of shoes. So what we can say, again, it's sort of, so we have October of 1762, we have shoes being made for Pomp and a Negro boy in East Hampton. And this is in a workshop that's behind the present day Hedges Inn in town. And, you know, lots of towns are going to have these records. So down here is, I don't like the way this keeps showing that thing, but we'll just pretend it's not there. So this is kind of a remarkable story here for those of you who know about East Hampton history. This is Aaron Isaacs, who I think is perhaps the son of the first Aaron Isaacs, who was celebrated as a Jew who converted to Christianity here. And it was kind of a big deal, was written about, it was preached in sermons. So here we have Aaron Isaac's child is getting a pair of shoes. It looks like Mary Isaac's getting some shoes here. And then down below, Aaron Isaac's Negro, F-I-L-E-S. It's probably Phyllis, but I'm not sure. And then Aaron Isaac's Negro child. I think when we started this project, we didn't even really know what that meant. Did that mean somebody was a servant, or were they enslaved? And the further we got, and the more we talked to people like Andrea, and began to see connections between documents, we understood that when you saw something that said Aaron Isaac's Negro Phyllis, that means that Phyllis was enslaved to Aaron Isaacs. And these Hedges books, there are, I don't know how many there are maybe 4 or 5 of these things, and they just go on and on and on. And throughout, you can find enslaved people getting shoes or getting shoes repaired. And of course, for the most part, I'm going to assume it goes on the account of Aaron Isaacs, and then we would find Aaron Isaacs paying his bill off later. But right there, we have an individual, and we can add to the list Phyllis, Pomp up above, and then this child as distinct individuals in a slice of time in East Hampton. And then you look and see, well, what was Aaron Isaacs doing? He was a farmer, and I think he did a little bit of merchant stuff on the side. And then you can look, this is jumping forward in time, but this is a 1800 census, 40 years later. And in the censuses, which you'd think would be incredibly valuable, what you get in a census is really what I would call corroborating detail. And that it would be people's race. Census takers were pretty rigorous about writing down what they thought was the ethnic background of the people. So on top here, we have Samson Cuffey. And over here, we have that there are 9 other free people of color in his household, and no enslaved people. This last column, enslaved people, we go, oh, well, there's 2 enslaved people here. Let's scoot across and see who that is. Well, it's John Parsons. And this might be Ephraim Parsons has a single enslaved person, and David Miller has an enslaved person. And here's Timothy Miller with an enslaved person. In 1800, mind you, this is in the twilight of slavery in New York State, by the way. Who else? Anybody else on this list? So, I mean, this is a remarkable thing. You've got sort of ordinary old East Hampton names, Parsonses and Millers, as slaveholders. And this was, it's pretty classic. Like, why wasn't I told? Well, I think we're not told because historians really sort of chose to omit this from the record. Now, I tell this story. It's my grandmother wrote the East Hampton Histories and Genealogy. I think it's actually that book there in the back. But I have her first draft upstairs on this blue typescript, and she has, in the draft, she has 2 paragraphs about slavery. And the first one is kind of, it's not a lot of detail, but she says, there was slavery here, and many of the families had slaves, and so on. It's kind of an honest, not sugar-coated treatment of slavery. In the final version, that paragraph's gone, and only the second paragraph is there, which is the one about how so-and-so freed his or her slaves. So it's only sort of a positive spin on slavery. And I think in some ways, even if you did know slavery existed in the North, you kind of thought, well, it can't be as bad as the slavery in the South. And I think it's a difficult thing to quantify, but family separation was a fact of life in slavery throughout the United States, and perhaps to a greater degree in the North, because there were not large plantation systems like in Virginia or the Carolinas or later in the Cotton Belt, which would keep families together. Here, it's extraordinarily common in the records, in the so-called slave narratives, for a man to be sold out of the community where his wife lived, or to have children sent somewhere else. It happens to Venture Smith, as a matter of fact.
Right.
And that's a kind of brutality that, for those of us who grew up and sort of thought of maybe the original television series Roots as physical brutality being sort of the definition of the inhumanity of slavery, I think, you know, being separated from one's children, I think it's probably many of us would prefer some form of physical punishment to that. And
Right. Right. Well, to David, to that point, let me see if I can share this document.
yeah.
Let's try this one. Okay, can you see that now? Okay. This is the transcript of the will of Nathaniel Sylvester, who was the original owner, one of the partners who owned Shelter Island, the entire island that they purchased for 1,600 pounds of sugar, and then 800 pounds of sugar from the indigenous Manhansett people. The purpose of the establishment of this place, which we call a provisioning plantation, was to provide raw materials for their sugar plantations on the island of Barbados. So that's the background. Nathaniel arrived with his wife Grizzle in 1652, built the original house, and worked the land. He owned 24 enslaved people, and when he died in 1680, this was the list of the enslaved people grouped by family and the bequest to his wife and to his children. Oops, sorry. And so you can see these groupings by family. Jacaro and Hannah were the property of his wife, Grizzle. She, when she arrived, was 16 years old and had newly come from London. Her father worked for King Charles, so she was not really suited for life in, you know, the wilds of Shelter Island. But she owned herself, Jacaro, Hannah, and their young daughter, Hope. And so in my telling of these stories, when I give tours, I have to imagine who Hannah, Jacaro, and Hope were, and why they may have been attractive to this young bride, the 16-year-old girl, Grizzle. Perhaps it was that they had worked in the plantation house in the Caribbean, in Barbados. Jacaro, we believe, may have been born in Africa. Hannah has an English name. She may have been Creole born in Barbados. And maybe she had experience running a home, of being a domestic. Perhaps more importantly, she may have spoken English in a way that Grizzle, newly come from London and being a cosmopolitan young woman, would understand. Hope was their young daughter. We have no way of knowing how old she was. But because Hannah, Jacaro, and Hope arrived with Grizzle when she first comes to Shelter Island, and if Nathaniel and Grizzle are the first couple, the first family of Shelter Island, then Hannah, Jacaro, and Hope are the first people of family of color to live on Shelter Island. And that's a distinction and importance for them that I can't overstate. When Nathaniel dies, Grizzle retains the ownership of Jacaro and Hannah, their daughter Isabel, who was born on Shelter Island, and may very well have been the first child of African descent born on Shelter Island, is given to his daughter Elizabeth. And then there are these other family groupings. Down here we have the family of Tamaru and Oreo, who we also believe were born in Africa, who were bequeathed to Nathaniel's son, Peter Sylvester. And their two children, two sons that are named Tom and Obium, were then sold on to the James Lloyd family, who were connected by marriage and who established Lloyd's Manor. Obium was first sent to Boston, and he attempted to run away on more than one occasion, perhaps to get back to Shelter Island, where he had been born, where his parents were. Eventually, he is moved from Boston and then to Newport, Rhode Island, and finally to Lloyd's Manor.
Donnamarie, excuse me, could you just scroll down the document a little bit? We've had a couple of requests.
Sorry. How do I do that?
Just scroll on your screen. We'll see what you.
Hang on.
If you just scroll over to the right-hand side, there's a bar.
Yep, I have to, yes, I got that. I just
Okay,
have to
awesome.
make sure that I get the right image. Okay. Can you still see it?
Yep.
Okay. It's not scrolling down anymore. Oops, I'm sorry. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Obium eventually goes to live at Lloyd's Manor. He marries another enslaved woman named Rose. They have a son whose name was Jupiter Hammond. Jupiter Hammond, although enslaved all of his life, was taught to read and write, and he was the first published African-American poet in the United States, having his work published in the late 1700s. And so in that way, we are able to take these names listed on this last will and testament from 1680 and then move them along, finding their names again in different documents, to having descendants. We are now in the process of trying to find current descendants who can trace their roots back to Tamaro and Oyo. So far we haven't had any luck, but this is an ongoing study, and we're never at the end. I see we're getting a little down in time, so Andrea, do you want to see if there's questions?
Well,
Sure, that would actually be great. We have a whole bunch of questions that I keep getting. I'm actually having trouble keeping up with all of them. But I did see one. One of the first ones I got was from Marianne Howard, who is with the East Hampton Historical Society. Marianne, let me see if I can find you and maybe unmute you and you can speak directly with your question. Here we go. Maybe? Marianne, can you unmute? There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea, and thank you both for a really wonderful presentation. I'd actually reached out to Andrea several months ago back during quarantine because I was interested in developing an education program, as you mentioned, with this curriculum for local schools. And so I just wanted to connect with you two after to perhaps partner and do something with that. But I've been looking at your research on your website and looking through the archives at the library also, and trying to formulate something that hits curriculum standards for the schools. So I'm just really excited that I was able to hear your presentation today, and I've been working on this kind of behind the scenes for a couple of months, and I'm happy to connect with you after this is done. Thank you for all of your research on this. It's amazing.
So
well, I just want to say one thing on the subject of schools. Is really was an East Hampton High School 10th grader who made the initial breakthrough for us, and in bringing it to a 7th grade class. And he made a 5-minute video and it's just wonderful. I should see if I can actually pull it up and show it. It would be sort of fun if I could grab it. Sorry, Andrea.
That's okay. I have another question that's actually kind of related to Marianne's question. And I've actually had a couple different forms of this question. But basically, your audience would really like to know how to support your project and support your research. And I can speak about, you've had volunteers come in and you've had high school students come in. And yes, the library is open and we are welcoming people that want to come and do research as part of this project. But I think there's probably some interest in other ways to support your project. And people are specifically asking about making donations, and they're asking about other ways they can help the project besides just research. So, if you guys could maybe address that, that would be great.
Donnamarie, do you want to do that?
Well, yes. Obviously, you can donate to the Plainside Project. I think we have a portal on the website for that. If not, we'll have one tomorrow. Or to the Sylvester Manor Educational Farm on Shelter Island. I would encourage everyone to come and visit the manor. The house is closed this season due to the pandemic, but our grounds and our farm stand are open. Fresh vegetables for everybody. And just being in touch with us, being involved, being supportive. This is something that we have been talking to local schools about initiating some kind of program or project to involve students in helping with the research, because it was students in East Hampton who started it off. And David has found that they are very good workers in reading these documents and really just sort of taking a hold of these mysteries and following them through. It's a lot like going down the rabbit hole when you start a genealogy and a family history. One thing leads to another, and the next thing you know, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And we have found that students are really interested in it. And so we have been talking to some of the different school systems in different towns, and we're hoping to have a sort of a curriculum formatted in the next couple of months.
We've really always depended on volunteer eyeballs to work with these documents. And we honestly, truly very much need help in doing a variety of things, from simply data entry of names and information that we found before, to pouring through the censuses to try and identify new people, particularly as we move forward in time, to try and sort of break through the barrier into the 20th century. Just today, speaking of the rabbit hole, I was looking for something for this talk, and see if I can just get this up for you. Okay, so this is the 1880 East Hampton census. This happens to be, I think, the Gardiner's Island page. And what you've got here, I hope you're sitting down, Donnamarie, this is Shem Gardner, only in 1880 he's 70, he's male, and he's black. And that means he's probably the son of the 1790 Shem, who goes over to Gardiner's Island with Nathaniel Donnamarie and two, I believe they're called Indian boys, to cut the timbers for Hook Mill. So this is an astonishing, you have a black gardener in 1880 living on Gardiner's Island, and he's born about 1810, which is after Hook Mill is built, perhaps with his father, perhaps with his grandfather's muscle and skill in felling the trees and hauling the wood. So this is an example of how we do need help, because right now I think our research department is probably just me at the moment. And so anyone who's interested in helping look through these old documents, censuses or other things, even an hour's help makes a huge difference. Because you sort of move the dial just a little bit, and you know, so now we have two generations of Shem. The names were frequently used like this, and I just stumbled on this because I was looking for something else. This is where we need help, and this is where we need help here in East Hampton and Southampton. We're getting super interested in Southampton's records, which we've just begun to scratch the surface. There are 86 enslaved people in Southampton, and I think it's 1698. Someone does a head count, basically, and
there's a census.
It's a census. Yeah, it's basically a census. I think, is it 86? 1680? At any rate, so it's a 17th century Southampton census that has 86 names of enslaved people on it. You know, those are not even in our database yet, I think. We haven't yet begun to put them into a format. And another thing that we'll need to do, and this is where people who are interested in genealogy and maybe you're on Ancestry.com can be incredibly helpful, is beginning to figure out how to get people like Shem Gardner here out beyond our little world, East Hampton, Plainsight Project, whatever. Because what if Shem Gardner's great-great-great-grandchildren live in, you know, Milwaukee and find us somehow? We're at a stage now where we really want to begin to share the work, and so we need help doing that. And anybody who wants to talk about the volunteer opportunities, all of this really can be done at home at this point. Get in touch with me at the Star or through plainsightproject.org. I think there's a contact us button. My email, easiest one to remember, is editor, editor, at ehstar.com. And even, as I said, even an hour a week or even an hour a month helps. And so, you know, any level of contribution is just incredibly welcome.
So I have a couple more questions for you guys.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
I don't want to keep you from volunteers. So the next one that I had gotten is from Carol, and she is asking about if there's any idea of how many slaves passed through Sylvester Manor and Gardiner's Island over the centuries. And I'm going to unmute her and let her kind of go back and forth with you.
Hi, how is everyone doing?
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so yes, I'm an Easthamptonite, and I kind of want to have an idea of how many slaves do you think actually passed through Sylvester Manor and Gardiner's Island over the centuries?
That's an interesting question. First of all, because I think for both of us doing this work, language matters. And so we don't refer to these individuals as slaves. We refer to them as enslaved people.
Okay, how many enslaved people
Okay.
through the manor?
Okay, so like I said, in Nathaniel Sylvester's 1680 will, he lists 24 enslaved people. That's the highest number that were ever enslaved at Sylvester Manor that I have found. Yes.
Oh, okay.
We have a burial ground, an Afro-Indigenous burial ground on the property.
I've seen it. It's great.
Yes,
Thanks.
and
Right.
with ground penetrating radar done by the archaeological team that has worked with us through the years from the University of Massachusetts at Boston, it's been determined that there are up to 200 people buried there.
Okay.
I don't know, I don't believe that there were ever 200 people in total enslaved at Sylvester Manor. I believe that this burying ground also contains the remains of indigenous people, as well as possibly other enslaved people from the town of Shelter Island, that they were brought there to be buried.
Mm-hmm.
So a definitive number is hard to guess. And I don't think we know about Gardiner's Island.
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, Gardiner's Island. I mean, I think you could probably work and get a fairly good number because the Gardiners, for the most part, were meticulous record keepers, some better than others, but they were, everybody had to be a good record keeper, really, because that's how, you know, getting back to the point, there's no currency, is you had to keep good records in order to get paid, basically. But I'm going to say that over the roughly 180 years that slavery was part of life on Gardiner's Island, somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals, living individuals. I think there's probably going to be plenty who die, you know, young. In fact, the earliest reference to an enslaved person in the town of Easthampton comes from about 1654, and it's described as a black boy who went missing on Gardiner's Island. Whether that meant he was old enough to work or not, I don't know. But I would be surprised if there were more than 200. The nature of the work here was, and in New England, throughout New England, really was not requiring vast numbers of field hands. It wasn't that kind of agriculture. You get that with tobacco in Virginia. But here, livestock really was the premium commodity, as best we can tell.
Okay.
Guys, I have two more questions too. So just
one last question: is there a gravesite on Gardiner's Island too of slaves the enslaved?
Yes, there is.
With no tombstones and etc.
Yeah.
Okay.
David, you're one of the few people that could answer that with that certainty.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you so much.
I have two more questions here. I think one of them is really a little bit more of a comment, and the other one's a question. Deanna, you are next, if I can find you in here. Deanna was actually talking a little bit about why she wasn't told. She kind of wanted to
Mm.
comment on that and discuss that a little bit. So let me unmute her. Oh, all right, there we go. Let's
Hi,
try
thanks so much. I'm Deanna Whitty Walker. I'm actually the executive director at Southold Historical Society, and I'm not a historian, so I don't pretend to be. But we do have a small exhibit at the Southold Historical Society, a permanent exhibit that tells the story or what we know of the story of 5 enslaved people that lived in one of our historic houses. And I think the question, and I think David, you might have maybe touched upon this or implied this about the families that were enslavers being prominent families in our community. And so many of the descendants of these families still live in the community. So when we talk about our families and the pride that we have, it's uncomfortable. It might be, you might be ashamed to admit that your family, that you're a descendant of a family that enslaved other people or other families. And so I think part of that is that when we now tell the story, which needs to be told and all people need to be represented, I think if we do it, and what we did at Southold Historical Society was we tried to do it in a factual way. So we didn't add that much emotion or point fingers. We really shared the stories of Zipporah or other people other enslaved people that lived in the Samuel Landon house. And so I think all of what you said really ties into that. And I think it's an important point. And I thank you for uncovering these histories and sharing them with the community.
Thank you so much, and we should talk. But you're absolutely right. There are descendants of these families that are still here, if not the descendants of the enslaved people. And what we always say is that we're talking about this subject. We're uncovering these individuals and trying to tell the stories of their lives and give them agency and make them 3-dimensional people. But we're not doing it with blame, and we're certainly not trying to cast shame. We all agree that slavery was what it was. It was a horrific and inhumane system tied to the economy and the founding of this country. That's what we take that as the given. However, the information that we're uncovering are about the lives of these people who were integral in the founding of this place that we all call home. And it's our responsibility, I feel, to learn their names, to say their names, to celebrate their names. Because as well as the founding families, they are founding families. Hannah, Jakara, and Hope, and Isabel are a founding family. And they have as much significance as the Sylvesters and the Deerings and the Nichols and everyone else who makes up that origin story. And so as we expand, and we hope to uncover more, and again, we're not historians either. I am not a history person, except I fell into it. But I'm a storyteller. And although my background has been behind the camera, or even behind the person with the camera in telling photo stories and photojournalism, now I'm on the other end. And it's been an exciting discovery about myself, about my connection to my community. As I said, I grew up in Sag Harbor as a lifelong summer person and now a full-time resident. This is the place of this is the home of my heart and the home of my spirit. And so learning all of this history, and that people of African descent like me were an integral part from the very beginning, is very powerful. And it makes it, it's not just that I love going to Sag Harbor because of summertime and the beach and everything that we do in the Hamptons. It grounds me here in a much more profound way. And I think it's done the same for David, who can trace his family back to the very beginning, and finding out these things about, his ancestors has been a journey. And not always an easy one, and certainly not a comfortable one. but definitely one worth taking. And that's really the purpose of this project, that these are stories worth telling. This is history worth uncovering. And that now, when we take it into the plain sight, because it is hidden in plain sight, but now let's bring it into the light. Let's celebrate it, and let's all move forward with it.
So I have a couple more questions that actually kind of build on sort of what you were talking about with how do we do that.
Okay.
So, and I actually, you know, I kind of wanted to add in at some point that the reason that we use that windmill in that image, many of you may have seen in the Star, Shem, who we were speaking about with that one index, was involved in building that windmill. So literally the built past with that sort of history in mind, it kind of segues nicely into the question from Sarah. She asks, in the age of cancel culture, do you think street names should be renamed out here? How do we incorporate all of this new information? And I think there's some other kind of questions and messages about how do we add interpretation or add that in a non-museum setting for our village and town.
we talk about that all the time. And yeah, street names is a fascinating one, and that kind of gets to, so we don't want to be the ones to make that call or that decision, but we want to provide enough data that if somebody did want to take that on, it's sort of unimpeachable. It's just, you know, here it is. And I'll just throw this out there. So so Reverend Buell was the third Reverend in Easthampton, was kind of a piece of work, but he was an enslaver, like a bunch of the rest of them. And so at some point in the records, there's a Dinah Buell, and she's a Black woman living in Easthampton. I think by this time, maybe Reverend Buell's underground. But, you know, I thought, cut me off, mute me if you think it's a bad idea, Andrea, but I thought, well, you know, if you rename Buell Lane in Easthampton Dinah Buell Lane, the maps don't really have to change. Not that I'm saying we should do this, but if you want the data, I got the data. Come over, I'll show you. And, you know, Dayton, Osborne, Hunting, James, Barnes, Baker, you know, it is a reasonable question to ask whether it is appropriate for us as a community to have this sort of honoring of people in the past. You know, I think the point with a lot of these things is not necessarily renaming a street, but having the conversation about renaming a street. Whether in the end it happens probably doesn't matter, but the argument about it is what gets the word out. And that's probably the greatest value if someone wanted to take our work and rename streets or build a monument or do whatever, is bringing it out, you know, into the dialogue.
Right. And it's also providing an overwhelming amount of information.
Yeah.
And having it be known by as many people as we can have listen to us.
Right, at whatever
read
level.
Stories,
Yeah.
Right, or visit our sites.
Yeah.
And just have it be really part of the public consciousness.
Yeah.
And then what happens after that,
yeah,
will happen after that.
Yeah.
But right now, the telling of the stories and the making of the discoveries, and I know that David and I will probably be talking, if not after this talk about Shem Gardner, then first thing in the morning.
Well, you know, I'm also writing a book, but I tell people that I'm platform agnostic, that if a book isn't a good way to get the message out, then we'll do a documentary film or a dance series or whatever. To me, it doesn't matter what the platform is, so long as we can begin to push this work out broadly. I'd like to see it cross the Sound and be picked up perhaps by schools in Connecticut and Rhode Island. It's really easy to do, particularly if there's church records. You just copy them. This is not PhD level rocket science.
No. Andrea, do we have one more?
Or a lot more.
I do, actually. I've been frantically trying to keep up with them. I have Rebecca. I have a couple more questions about cancel culture, and somebody, let's see, I think it was Carrie Clark, was asking, or I guess she wanted to talk about a piece that NPR had done.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for the wonderful work in the presentation. I think it's fantastic. I'm a history teacher, so this is a topic that's very, very important and relevant to me. I wanted to share that I recently listened to an NPR story about two women who were descendants of enslavers and enslaved people. The name of the NPR story is how descendants of an enslaver and a slave became friends. Mm-hmm. And they had published an article in Washington Post magazine, which I haven't read, but in getting to that question of looking at descendants possibly and finding them and figuring out how to do that sensitively, if that's where this project goes or someone else takes it, it might be worth taking a look at the work that they did. Their names are Deborah Bruno and Eleanor Meyer. And it was aired on NPR just August 13th.
Right.
So I think that that is something that could be interesting.
Good one.
Yes, yes. It actually, I read the piece in the Washington Post. It was really excellent. And that is a question that comes up about descendants. And so far at this point, we haven't really been dealt with it. You know, we haven't uncovered either descendants of the enslaved, as I said. There are descendants of the enslavers, but we really haven't had those conversations yet. So right. In a lot of ways, we are, even though we're 3-4 years into this project, and the work that I do at Sylvester Manor, I've been doing now for 5 years, we're still so much in the beginning. There's still so much to learn. There's still so much exponentially for it to grow. Taking it into schools, taking it into the public consciousness, having articles published in the Star regularly, David writing a book, my giving tours. And of course now during the pandemic, we are doing things differently. And if this was a normal summer, perhaps we wouldn't be doing this talk quite this way or reaching as many of you. So there are some blessings, some hidden blessings in the situation we find ourselves in this summer. That we've been able to literally take our show on the road and reach a wider audience. And I hope this really does stimulate further conversations with all of you as participants. And because obviously David and I, we just love talking about this stuff. And,
yeah, more questions.
And if you want to come help us, you know, please do.
I think what you're doing, beginning with capturing the stories, identifying the people who they were, putting their names on the staircase, for instance, and all of the other things is a fantastic place to begin, or, you know, to foreground. But I can see this, you know, like you said, just expanding outward in so many different ways, and I think it's really fantastic. So you'll be getting an email message from me.
Thanks,
so I can help you with the steps that you're taking now.
Lovely.
Thank you.
One of the stories I remember that was really interesting to me was about how the Shinnecock Indians taught the local settlers how to do whaling, and they were out there whaling, and all the young men of the Shinnecock tribe, so many of them were drowned in a whaling accident. And then, do you remember hearing that story, David?
Well, it's what we're talking about, what you're talking about today. By the way, I'm just going to put my email up here in case someone wants to talk to me. But what that is actually a complicated story. That's the, I can never pronounce it right. It's a Circassian, which was a shipwreck. And though Shinnecock men were involved in whaling and teaching whaling, this was a case where the Shinnecock men were sent aboard as salvagers to try and save the wreck. And a storm came. The ship was in fairly good condition, I think, when it hit the beach, but the storm came up and some vast number of the adult males of the tribe died. It was extraordinary.
And as a result, what I was told as a little girl is that a lot of the black community members ended up becoming the wives the husbands of the Shinnecock Reservation, the Shinnecock tribe, which is now the Shinnecock Reservation. And I remember growing up, a lot of white people saying to me, oh, they're not real Indians, they're really black. And I was like, they're black and they're Indians. And it was really interesting to know some of the people that were Shinnecock and African American. And I never thought to ask, because I didn't know that we had slavery on Long Island until 1827. So I never thought to ask them, or the history teachers that I had in the middle school and high school who were African American, if any of their ancestors had been enslaved. And I can remember, one of my
I'm not sure what just happened. That was not me. Are you back?
But we could speak to that briefly. I think, Donnamarie, we probably should. I mean, there's a very long history of all ethnic backgrounds, indigenous, of African heritage, white, and then the divisions within divisions of coming together in the New World. And that, that's just one of the many examples. And frankly, if you look at censuses, a family that might be identified as black in 1810 turns up as Indian in 1820. And so there's a very fungible, I think this whole concept of race and hard race divisions can be.
It shows racism in our society. Basically, it really shows a lot of racism.
Yeah.
And I'm just really fascinated to know more about the prominent Black citizens in our community when I was growing up, and what their take is on it, because I never asked them.
Right.
And I was school friends with a lot of their children, and they have stories and they have family history that goes way back, way back to the founding. So they must have been slaves.
Well,
they must have been enslaved.
Let me just say one thing very quickly on that score, is that by 1880 in the census, really most, if not all, of the names change and the backgrounds change of Black folks living here. Most of the ones are come from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. You can see it in the 1880 census. So it really raises the question, if we're talking about enslaved people here from, the prior nearly 2 centuries, where did they go? And we don't know the answer to that yet, but there's a discontinuity between Black Americans of the 20th century or late 19th century and Black Americans here of the beginning of the 19th century, 18th century, and 17th century. Very, very interesting disconnect.
Yeah.
Could I say something as a Shinnecock tribe member?
Please.
Please.
Hi, I'm Kelly Dennis.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi. Hi, Donnamarie. We had such a cool tour of the mansion. Oh my gosh, I miss that place so much. So yeah, I actually did a talk and covered the subject a little bit with the parish. I think it was last month, 2 months ago, lost track of time. But yeah, you mentioned the Circassian before, and the history with whaling, and how much that our people have mixed with other people, especially African Americans, people who ancestors were enslaved. And another thing, part of that is the indentured servitude that a lot of our ancestors were in, and that was a lot of it a result of whaling. It's some of our ancestors were able to make some money, but others, and have like a house on the reservation once we were moved onto the Shinnecock Neck where we live now. But a lot of them incurred a lot of debt and had to pay off those debts through indentured servitude. And, that was a thing that went like for a long time, and while the whaling industry was.
There's actually a period where people were freed and indentured as well. So that would have added to the deaths and other things being worked up. So yeah.
Yeah.
And it was after the Circassian incident, what had happened was a lot of local newspapers and newspapers in the city with the last of the Shinnecocks.
Yeah.
It was kind of a time for people to come and do a big, basically huge land grabs and just take resources that were ours and everything else as a way to just, it's part of the kind of ongoing systematic racism of just kind of taking away the rights and resources of the original inhabitants here, saying that, we're all Black and and they would actually say that to people living on the reservation with cattle and their farm hands and everything. They would be like, you can't have your own house because you're not Native anymore. But now we've come to realize that being Native American is not just a racial identity, it's also political. We're actually government, entities who have relationships with state, local, federal government, and we have the right to say who our members are and how used or if we use by quantum or go by descendancy or not. So that is why, we look like we do. We're all rainbow of people, and we're Shinnecock, and we're proud, and we are Native, and we just have a different, I think it's very, very different from every tribe is so different. And, but it's really, it's amazing that we're still here.
Absolutely.
It's really true.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And it's so great to see you. And
you too.
we should talk too. Everybody, we should talk.
We did a great job with that. And I actually was going to say something when we finished this question about how there's a lot of parallels with what Andrea was talking about in terms of the talk that we had just done, our last Zoom event, the Fowler House. Allison was dealing with a lot of the same conversation and questions. And Kelly, you did a fantastic job of kind of tying in the whole narrative and the arc and all of the indentured servitude, which so many formerly enslaved people were given, you kind of put in this state where they were still being sold well after 1827. Locally, and how that kind of builds and adds into kind of a permanent system. So very nicely done.
And one thing I actually forgot to, even before the indentured servitude, and some of us were enslaved in this area too, if my grandmother would tell me that if we didn't accept Christianity and speak English and not our native tongue, that we would have our tongues cut out and be sold into slavery. A lot of us actually were sold, and we were, I think Donnamarie was saying like this big kind of sugar trade that would come from I think
Barbados in the West Indies.
Yes.
I have relatives down in Barbados and the Caribbean because of this slave trade that we were originally. So.
Exactly. So we have even wider space to research and to find the diaspora of people from this area. There's the African diaspora of being brought from Africa to be enslaved on Long Island, and vice versa of Native people being enslaved and sent to work on the sugar fields in the Caribbean. So.
Which was essentially a death sentence. It was considered, basically the end of the line, and was not something that many people survived. Black or indigenous, or it's extraordinarily difficult life.
Yes, one of the things that David and I talk about a lot as we gather more and more information, as we see different connections. And similarly, if you do genealogy, first you start with your little core of your family, and then as you learn more, you learn about, well, what was happening in the place that they lived and what was going on economically. And so as we progress and as we gain more names and as our stories get fuller and bigger and more connected, we see the connections to well, what was happening in the local economy? What was happening in the economy of the region of Long Island, of New York, of the Northeast? And the connections that that economy makes specifically to the Caribbean and the sugar industry. And the place that Long Island and the eastern end of Long Island plays in that triangle trade of sugar being grown in the Caribbean and the West Indies of Barbados and Jamaica, being brought up the coast to New England, to Long Island, and then sent on to Europe.
Wow.
And the whole concept of provisioning those plantations in the Caribbean, and how that was so integral to the economy of Long Island, of Shelter Island, of East Hampton. And as we find more details, we're connecting the dots. And then I'm going to ask David to tell the story about the cattle and the church, just so you really see how these things kind of had to come together.
Super quickly, one of my epiphanies in this whole thing was, East Hampton, we always sort of heard this legend that we had the biggest and most expensive church on Long Island was commissioned in 1715 across the street, where Guildhall in East Hampton is today. Biggest and most expensive church on Long Island, 1715. It's, first services 1717. And you stop for a minute and go, wait, what? What do you mean most expensive? What do you mean, biggest? How did these hardscrabble farmer fishermen, people afford this palace, this wooden cathedral? Well, the answer is they were wealthy. And why were they wealthy? Is because they were tied into this global sugar. Sugar was the oil of its day. And in America, after the beaver gave out, basically, sugar was the name of the game. It was what fueled empire. And no matter how small a farmer you were here, you could get a piece of the sugar game by shipping livestock or flax or leather or shoes or anything to market. And the market, to a large extent, was in the Caribbean, British Caribbean. One of the amazing things, so we've got H.P. Daring, who was the customs master later in life in Sag Harbor. He was a factor for the gardeners running herring, barrel staves, and horses to Haiti during the Revolution, during the American Revolution period. Products from here are being sold to plantation owners there, and the herring, incidentally, sells very quickly. For some reason, the horses don't sell. I'll just very quickly, Andrea, I do want to just show this amazing document that pops up at the New York Public Library. And here's
wrap it up. That's all right. I just was trying to slow down some of the questions.
Oh, well, this is part of H.P. Daring's sort of daily logbook. And, he writes all these letters back and forth about, how hard it is to sell the horses and how ungrateful the still French plantation owners are, and so on. And he's running that stuff for one of the gardeners. This is one of the...
Just to interject more quickly, so this is Henry Packard Daring, who's born at Sylvester Manor.
Right, the ties are crazy, right?
The ties are crazy.
Here he is, selling goods to massive sugar enslavers down in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, I guess it was called at that point. I feel like we get so much guidance, in a sense, from the interests of people we talk to. So if there are some quick thoughts or questions, to me, that's hugely important. Andrea, will you humor me for a second?
Absolutely. And I also think it's really important that people reach out and contact you guys and continue the conversation. There's a lot of people that are very interested. So go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for...
There's one more. It's asking about whether or not when the slave trade ended here, did enslavers take their enslaved people to the South? Slaves from here to enslaved people, where did they go? I think it's asking.
Yeah, I actually suspect
they moved.
That probably did happen. There are a number of so-called slave narratives that do describe gangs capturing free blacks in the North and bringing
that was part of Fugitive Slave Act propaganda.
Right.
Be careful with that.
Well, yeah. there's a wonderful book here, the Half Has Never Been Told. I forget where, and a large section of that book deals with the couples that were marched from Carolinas to Alabama and Mississippi. So
right. But I don't think we have stories of it in the research that we've done so far.
yeah, although we do have this fact that the people disappeared.
Yes.
So where did they go is
go?
the $64,000 question. But they absolutely, many of them just disappear. Some of them end up in New York. We follow one of the Platos to New York. And Lodowick, London Dayton, right? He ends up in New York. He comes back. He's upstate. But those right now are the exception rather than the rule to what we know. But I suspect there may have been a fair amount of kidnapping.
Well, I have a quick question. So beside kidnapping, if you had a family member that actually moved from say this area to the south, like a Sylvester moved from this area to the south, my question would be, did they take their slaves with them, or were they given slaves when because slavery was still, I guess, permanent in the south?
Wow, that's kind of another rabbit hole with the indentures continue to be sold, which we actually have documentation on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
That's an excellent question.
It is an excellent question.
It's complicated. I think we probably should try to address that one separately, because it's going to get into like the whole what's going on with the Fugitive Slave Act, Lyman Beecher's propaganda, and so on.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Wow.
That also might explain what David was saying about the people from the black people from the South coming in the late 19th century and not knowing where the early 19th and late 18th century black people went that were actually from this area. So maybe they went south and then they came back later.
Yeah, it's possible.
Some we have up further up Suffolk County. There's a lot of different things that they're tracking with this project. So it is a good question to come back to. I think it's a big piece of, if you're interested in working with the project, that's a great place to kind of contact David and Donnamarie about it. At this point,
Have you looked into the Davis family? Because I remember our organist, Colonius Davis, that worked for the Presbyterian Church, because my dad was the minister there for a couple decades. And then Colonius Davis, he came from the South and then moved here, and he was the organist for the Baptist Church and also for the Presbyterian Church. And he was really well known in the South. And I'm just wondering if and I know a lot of the Davis family, like Alita's family, her mom was a Davis, and I think some of them were also they also served in World War II as the Tuskegee Airmen. We have Tuskegee Airmen here that are from our families.
Why don't you email us about that? Because that's a good reminder. I think the Davises, certainly that's not an early name here, but that's such a fascinating part of the story. And I think what we're trying to do is network with other communities and provide a window into our work by joining up with other groups doing similar work, so that descendants and family members can begin to understand their full story.
Right.
Are you researching in Bridgehampton?
You want to start for us?
Yeah, that's one of the areas.
Yes, I would like to.
Okay, then great. Then let's talk.
Yeah.
I'm really eager people.
Thank you.
Working with you guys, but at this point, I really do need to try to wrap this up.
Okay.
Allow David and Donnamarie an opportunity to make any closing comments, but I really need to ask you guys to, the rest of the audience, just kind of let them wrap up and direct any questions to them. Personally, you can email me if you didn't catch David's email. Donnamarie's email with Sylvester Manor is available online, and certainly just reach out if you're having trouble getting in contact with them. But there's Plain Sight Project online.
Right.
There's some great ways to continue this, and it's good to see so many people that are enthusiastic. It's a good problem to have. But unfortunately, I do need to kind of wrap things up a little.
Let me say very quickly that I think this is the kind of project that slowly can change America, and that's why I'm doing it. I think it has because it's simple, it has the possibility to, I think, to really move the dial. That's it for
Exactly.
me.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. This
Yeah,
has been a
thank you.
really extraordinary event. And again, we will keep you posted on new discoveries, new stories that we have. In the meantime, please get in touch for any kind of help that you can offer, and we'll figure out ways that you can work. Also, please come to Shelter Island. It's beautiful in the fall. The trails are open. And come and learn our stories. Thank you. And thank you, Andrea, for hosting this. This has been really
Yeah,
fabulous.
thanks everybody for coming.
For this
Just
amazing
really,
program. This has been, I mean, it's just been wonderful to hear you two do what you do so well, and, to share your enthusiasm. So hopefully we'll be talking with you guys some more about some other discoveries soon. And I'm just going to say, everybody go off and stay with this enthusiasm. Please keep it with you and have a wonderful evening. Feel free to reach out if you need more questions answered, but have a good evening, everybody. Bye-bye.